Well, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Megan, I'm with West Monroe, and we are going to start this webinar. Looks like we've got just under 100 people joined, so we're going to give folks another 1 minute and then go ahead and get started. Again, for everyone joining, as I mentioned, my name is Matt Sondag, and I'm with West Monroe Partners, and thanks for attending our webinar on GDPR. I'm joined by three of my colleagues, Sean Curran, Nathan Bew, and Keith Swat. We can see that there's a lot of folks on the webinar right now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We've intentionally kept this to 30 minutes. We know everyone's busy. We figured we'll give you the Cliff Note version of this new legislation. We also plan to stay on the line beyond 30 minutes, so for those folks that have more time than 30 minutes, we're happy to stay on the phone after and answer any additional questions. We only have about 6 slides of actual content in terms of what makes up this legislation. And then we think a good idea to actually roll through some real examples and kind of apply the law so you can kind of see how it's applied. Also muted all the dial-ins, so we won't hear any background noise. So if you do have questions, you have to submit them through the actual webinar. So we will either answer your questions real time, or we will batch them and leave them to the end. We're only planning to go about 20 minutes of 20 or 22 minutes of slide content, so we'll save some time at the end for questions. And then the last point is, I think this is a very timely topic for 2 reasons. One, this law is going into effect in a month. So we're talking about something that's going live in a year from now, and we've got plenty of time to act on it. It is around the corner. I think the second thing is, with the high-profile face testimony last week on Capitol Hill, in terms of how they were, collecting, storing, protecting, and sharing data, we think this topic is very relevant, and this is really what GDPR is all about. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Sean Curran, who's going to walk through the first couple slides. Sean, take it away.
So think about data privacy across the world, and when we talk about Europe, especially the European Union, there's been data privacy rules in effect for many years. In fact, we go back to 1995 is the most recent or the most current Data Protection Act. Since then, European Union has been in a process of implementing other security controls and privacy rules. We all know about EU Safe Harbour, which was overturned about 3 years ago now. We have the EU Privacy Shield that was negotiated between the European Union and the US as a means of replacing EU Safe Harbour. But over the last 4 years, or over a fairly extended period, the EU has started to create individual member state privacy laws. So in Brussels or Germany or France, there is individual privacy laws, not dissimilar to the way in which the US operates from their privacy standpoint. Each of those privacy laws, though, differ in some respects, and many of them cross over. So what the European Union has tried to do is create a single standard for privacy across the entire Union, irrespective of where you're located. Conversely, we've got our own privacy acts. We've got the US Privacy Act of 1974, which only applies to US government agencies. We've got the Spam Act, which actually aligns in some ways to the GDPR from a principle standpoint, really focused on reducing the amount of spam within email, not just within email, but in other channels. You've got privacy laws like HIPAA, which are really focused on EPHI, which again shares some principles with GDPR that we'll talk through later on through this webinar. And then we've got state-based privacy laws, with the most significant of those being Massachusetts and California, where the US has enacted privacy requirements and reporting requirements that again aligns fairly similarly with GDPR. The reality, though, is the US today does not have anything that aligns completely with GDPR or is as all-encompassing and all-enforcing as GDPR. when we talk, though, it's important to understand that organisations across the world are going to be impacted by GDPR. It's not just those organisations residing in Europe. It's focused on residents of the European Union. And this is an important distinction because we've heard a lot of comments over the past couple of years as this has become real of people talking about citizenship versus residency. The reality is, if you are a resident of the European Union, irrespective of your citizenship, you're already covered by GDPR. So a US citizen residing in Spain will have GDPR protection and protection under GDPR. Contrary, if you're a citizen who happens to be travelling in the US for a period of time, you're not protected in the US from anything from a GDPR standpoint. So it's an important thing to understand that it's a residency-based. The other part is also understanding all the various countries that are covered under the European Union. A great example I heard just yesterday out in RSA in San Francisco was countries that are pretty close to the US, places like the British Virgin Islands or Tahiti, which are all actual member states of the European Union. So those countries that you may not be considering, so Grand Cayman being a location or a part of the British Empire, is still covered under GDPR. It will be US companies that are operating offices in Europe. So anyone that is operating an office in the European Union, irrespective of which location in the European Union, will be affected by GDPR and have requirements around GDPR. Organisations that are providing goods and services in the European Union. The important distinction that often gets made here is even if they don't pay for them. Well, while many people will equate that to charity-based organisations, the reality of something like Facebook is you don't pay for Facebook as a service. They provide you a service that is, and revenue is generated from advert material other than from you paying for it as an individual. Those organisations are being targeted by GDPR and included in the scope of GDPR. So while many other legislations are focused on the services that you provide and are paid for, GDPR is covering all those organisations that aren't necessarily even being paid for by a citizen. So you can't claim that I don't direct any revenue from that European Union, therefore I'm not in scope. That's not a de-scoping mechanism for GDPR. And then finally, any company under any circumstances that is monitoring the behaviour of an EU resident will be in scope for GDPR. The other important distinction from that is the online or offline. If someone is deploying a cookie on someone's browser, and a cookie is used typically to identify or to provide information back to their website, if they deploy that cookie onto the browser or collect cookies from browsers offline, and this is something that came up as part of the Facebook testimony, when they reconnect, anything that has changed in that cookie that they collect would be considering monitoring of the behaviour. So much of the testimony provided by Mark Zuckerberg to Congress actually highlight areas where Facebook will have challenges associated with GDPR. With that, I hand over to Nathan Bew and allow him to talk about some of the requirements associated with GDPR.
Yeah, as Sean mentioned, I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of what GDPR compliance requires. And as you mentioned earlier, sort of similar to HIPAA in the US, GDPR is a law, so that it will be enforceable by governments throughout the EU. First example is guaranteeing consumers easier access to view their personal data. Organizations being told they tell how this information is used in a clear and understandable way, and ahead of, what this information back to consumers. Next, hiring organizations to obtain consent from consumers before storing or processing this data. And this includes something as simple as pop-up messages on websites, and those pop-up messages outlining, what's being collected, who it's being shared with, giving an opportunity for consumers to provide a very clear yes or no answer as to whether they want this to continue to be stored in their systems. Next, providing opt-out options for consumers to make sure that data does continue to be stored if they don't want it to be. So this can come out through mailing lists. Facebook could have pop-up messages as well, allowing that information to be opted out. And on this page, the last one is the right to be forgotten process. So this is where consumers are that have data that's already stored in existing systems on other organizations. They're able to request that that data be removed. And one of the key points around this one is the organizations need to have systems in place that make it easy to delete information. But more importantly, they have to have an audit mechanism where they can clearly show the government or these consumers that, yes, they have deleted the information and show kind of when that was to happen. Another piece with this one is it's not going to apply to every single organization. So governments or financial institutions, healthcare organizations, if they require that information for certain reasons, they do not have to delete that if they're asked by consumers. And then run through a couple more on this page. So where all GDPR information is in scope, in-scope data is stored, how it's used, and who's responsible for it. Conducting data privacy impact assessments, which is just a longer way of basic risk assessments to understand the risks in the environment. These are on new systems or existing systems and need to be regularly refreshed, so it's not a one-time thing. GDPR is trying to make it as a privacy by design and check the box exercise that a lot of these previous data privacy regulations have become. Next, similar to the last one, is not only risk assessments on existing systems, but also risk assessments on vendors. So vendor risk assessments are going to be important in that if a vendor is processing data on behalf of a company, that vendor, if they are breached, the data that they have, the company that is using that vendor may be held accountable under GDPR. And then finally, a data privacy officer in certain cases. So these DPOs are not going to be required for all companies, and those do require them. They can either have it as an internal role or even outsource it if needed. Are going to require a DPO are going to be all government agencies and that are processing, sensitive information like financial data, healthcare information, race, religion, etc. And then any company that is storing and processing large amounts of data, even if it's not sensitive. And the issue with this one is the GDPR hasn't really provided any guidance yet on what is going to constitute a large amount of data. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith to talk through breach notification.
Thanks a lot. So now we're going to talk about some of the fun stuff. What happens with an organization if they wake up one morning and a bad thing happens and they need to actually act on their incident response plan. So first of all, in the event of a breach, the organization is required to notify their supervisory authority within 72 hours of discovery. The supervisory authority is kind of like a different name for the regulator that each EU member state is going to create to manage the compliance of GDPR for organizations within their state. Organizations that operate in multiple EU member states will have to choose which supervisor authority they want to report to, and that will be based on a number of factors. So say that this breach resulted in the exposure of personal data. The organization is required to notify all affected victims. So basically, this differs a bit from U.S. Regulations, which don't normally require a breached organization to notify victim directly. Rather, in the U.S. the breached organization has a victim that they cannot identify, they're allowed to make a public statement about the breach and let the victims kind of come to it and find out for themselves. It's not the case with the GDPR. Organizations must directly notify their victims. In the event of a breach and the organization is found non-compliant by the supervisory authority of the GDPR requirements, a couple things are going to happen. Notably, fines and penalties. Now, all heard the number, 20 million euros or 4% of global revenue. That's basically what everybody's been going to organizations with kind of a fear, uncertainty, and doubt concept. However, it's really important to note that that's up to that amount. There are a great deal of factors that are going to come into play when the EU determines the amount of a fine and the type of penalties. Those could include, the nature, gravity, and duration of the infringement, right? I mean, one of the big no-nos would be is, I could see a company getting pretty maximum fines if they fail to notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours, or if they sit on it for a year, like we've seen many breaches happen in the past. Lack of technical and organizational measures. I mean, if a company is storing sensitive data, personal information, and they're not safeguarding it, they're derelict in their responsibilities to the data subjects and the EU citizens. So that could count against them pretty big. And then also, prior infringements. I mean, what if this is not the first time this has happened? Maybe the first time they got a written notice, but now the next time it's a little bit more serious. And then finally, it's the type of personal data involved. And one thing is that with GDPR, personal information can kind of range in its sensitivity. Everything from like name and address would be a little lower on the scale. High scale would be health information, behavioral information, and any kind of information that can be used to affect the privacy and rights of an individual. So we have a couple of examples. We wanted to kind of create these to give you guys kind of a view into what we've been seeing in the marketplace and how we've seen organizations go about scoping themselves for GDPR. So in the first scenario, we have a US-based software company that maintains a development team in Germany of 30 people. So what puts them, the data that they're collecting is, HR-related sensitive information for EU employees. I mentioned before, HR information, health information, health insurance data, government IDs, these are relatively high on the sensitivity model for GDPR. So it puts these guys in scope, but there's a low risk. And the reason why the risk is lower is that with 30 employees, the volume of this information is very low. Also, when we're looking at an employer situation, gaining consent from employees to store their information is much easier. And you can do that at regular interviews through, with, review sessions or whatnot. So this situation is a little bit more lower risk. When we look at scenario number 2, we got a U.S.-based retail company selling goods in the EU via an e-commerce platform, basically website. Now, what they're doing is that they're collecting personal information, such as customer name, address, email address, IP address, geolocation for marketing purposes. Now, given they're an e-commerce platform or they're selling goods, the volume is going to be a lot higher of this data. So these guys are in scope, but it's a moderate risk. Now, we've got a moderate risk because even though the volume is high, the relative sensitivity of the data being maintained is a little bit lower on the scale for GDPR. And I have a social media company that uses EU resident personal data and behavioral metrics to sell ads. I mean, this is something that's been very popular in the news lately. And this company is basically gathering name, address, email address, location data, and more importantly, behavioral information. The GDPR, this puts them in scope, and it's very high risk because you have two things happening. Social media sites have a tremendous volume of users. Also, the type of data, behavioral information, kind of ranks a little bit high on the sensitivity for GDPR. That coupled with the fact that consent is very difficult for social media companies. You know, before you sign up for a social media page and you might consent to them using your information, every time they change the purpose or what they're going to do with that information, under GDPR, they should be getting another form of consent. So high volume, the behavioral data, and the complex consent scenarios make this a very high-risk proposition. That's scenario 4. Let's look at this, a U.S.-based medical clinic that serves EU citizens. You know, we're in New York, and we have a lot of expats, and what if one of these guys breaks their leg, and they go into a hospital, and they take all kinds of very sensitive information? These guys be in scope? No, because GDPR only applies to PI or sensitive data that's being collected from people, EU residents, while they are inside the EU, not outside. In a scenario, think about an economic research company that's trying to figure out what people make in different areas. So they send out a web survey, and they collect 2 pieces of information from the form, the bill code and the salary. Now, when the people submit this form, attached to that is their IP address. Now, since the GDPR views the IP address as something that could be used to look up someone's identity, that would normally put these guys in scope. But what they've decided to do, since they don't need that IP address information, they anonymize it. They basically obfuscate it so it can't be tied back to the original data subject. So it actually puts those guys out of scope. That's my last scenario. With that, I'll pass it over to Sean for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Kate. So a couple of things to think about of what's going on in the press at the moment and that we're seeing in other locations is a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt there. As Nick mentioned, the €20 million or 4% of revenue, whichever is higher, is being touted as you need to be doing something about GDPR. The though is it's only just going into effect in May. As a result, we don't really know how it's going to be enforced. And as Keith mentioned, there are provisions within the regulation to provide written warnings. So it's a bit difficult to be saying for every organisation, 4% of your revenue is at risk as a result of GDPR. What that is really, for most organisations, they need to take a more balanced view of it. Ignore the fear, uncertainty and doubt and start to look at what's the real risk to me? How much data do I truly collect? And are the measures I'm putting in place in alignment with that potential risk? So, testing is for everyone is thinking about taking a balanced approach. First is, if you're a private equity firm and you've got an organisation that is looking at an exit process in the next 12 months, it's going to be on the agenda. Whether a security company like ourselves that are looking at it from a security standpoint, or whether it's going to be legal, someone is going to ask the question of GDPR. So a program needs to exist. It doesn't need to be complete. You have to be in compliance by May 25th. You just need to be prepared to do it. The reality is that May 25th date is when it comes into effect. But as seen with PCI and HIPAA and other regulations and contractual obligations out there, non-compliance is not going to get you a fine. Nobody will start auditing organisations on May 25th and start doling out fines for a lack of compliance. It only comes into effect if you have a breach. That means you look at GDPR and applying a program to the GDPR approach, you need to start considering what really matters. Some more consumer-focused component, right to be forgotten, are probably a higher priority than some of the others. What what are the areas that I'm most likely to get high-ranging fines from a breach of, as opposed to just, I'm going to get a slap on the wrist. So for most organisations, they can take a roadmap-based approach that means not necessarily going to be rushing to be compliant by May 25, but they're going to be looking at applying security principles and privacy principles over the longer term. I think that's important, especially for anyone who's sitting there right now thinking, I've got a portfolio company and they're into the whole period and I haven't done anything to address GDPR today. I've got a month to figure it out. We can really put together a program that is more balanced in nature and that still applies good security and privacy principles without necessarily being 100% GDPR compliant. The same way, if you're doing diligence on an organisation today, is there is value in understanding where they are in GDPR and primarily focusing on how much potential risk you may be inheriting or the potential changes they may need to make to be able to become compliant with GDPR. Some of the scenarios that Keith just walked through are examples of organisations we've seen in the last 2 or 3 months that have GDPR requirements. And understanding their business and therefore knowing the risk element is an important piece to evaluate as part of the transaction. With that, Matt, for some questions from anyone.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Keith. We've got almost 50 questions in, so we won't be able to get to all of them, but let's start with a couple of them. As far as, Sean, maybe I'll start with you on this one. I think one of the biggest things that I picked up on is what we're used to here in the States regarding breach notification. The days of Uber and Yahoo waiting a year or 2 years before announcing that seems like a very big delta. So maybe you can kind of confirm that, but also in terms of them having to individually reach out to the individuals, that to me seems like a very different from an effort perspective, a large business distraction. Comments?
Yeah, so importantly, the 72 hours is a focus on letting the regulators know. So the member state regulators are who has to be informed, not the individuals themselves. Interestingly, if you look at somewhere like, I think the state of Virginia, you've got 2 weeks to notify the individual. So there are some state-based laws right now that actually focus on how long you've got to make individual notifications. This is not part of GDPR. GDPR is 72 hours to notify the regulators, and you'll be able to start to look at who to notify and how do I notify them. So that's the first part. That is, if you're a US-based company that has no operations in Europe, but you happen to market or sell services to Europe, so you've got no presence, you're just happening to sell services, you're going to have to determine which member states you're going to report to. As Keith sort of pointed out, each European Union member state, so whether it's France, whether it's Italy, whether it's the UK, each one of those is going to create their own regulatory body for reporting. You're going to determine who you're going to report to. So there'll be some, I believe, to look at who's going to be a little more lax in their enforcement of GDPR, who's going to be a little bit easier to work with, whether that's because they are English-speaking versus native English-speaking versus Spanish or French or German. And therefore, who you're going to position your reporting to. But given you've got 72 hours, it's something you probably want to prepare for earlier. The last your question, Matt, around the reporting obligation piece is 100% right. In the US, you typically just have to announce that you've had a breach. So if you take Yahoo, there's still announcements coming out, or if we take Equifax as a great example, you go and identify if you're impacted by that. You may get a letter if they know you, but in the retail breaches of the Target days or Home Depot, where they really didn't know anyone who walked into their store more than the credit card number, they didn't have an individual reporting requirement. In fact, they actually require you to individually, one-on-one report. That means sending letters to each of those individuals, which could be fairly difficult to track down, especially if you're not storing the data post-transaction. So if we take the Target breach where the transactions, where each credit card number was caught in memory and Target didn't necessarily store the data, it would be difficult to track down all of those affected. and costly.
Yeah, okay. That was one of the biggest thoughts, was just the business distraction is significant there in the effort. One of the questions that came in was, I could get sure. I heard that joining the privacy deal provides compliance to GDPR. Can you comment on this approach?
Yeah, I get one. Basically, GDPR specifies that controllers and processors need to adhere to transmission protocols and rules and regulations. Now, Privacy Shield is basically a list, it's a compliance list of ways to transfer information to the United States in a secure manner. So they're kind of mutually exclusive. It can, basic mechanics of it are compliant with GDPR, but it does not make an organization compliant with GDPR because it really applies to transferring of data across borders.
Got it.
As opposed to other aspects. Just to add a little bit, so GDPR is far more wide-ranging than that. The right to be forgotten is not covered under Privacy Shield. Other components of GDPR are not covered under Privacy Shield.
Okay, great. Here's another question that came in. Can an organization outsource the DPO responsibilities, the data privacy officer responsibilities?
And I can take that one. Yes, that is something that is allowed. It can either be outsourced or it could be an internal role, really depending on, some of the organization. Some may not have the budget to necessitate a dedicated role for that. So yes, you can outsource that in certain cases.
Got it. Next question came in was, what effect will Brexit have on GDPR?
I could take that one. So, basically when the UK announced on March 29th that they are going to be leaving the EU, they basically gave a timeline of at least 2 years for that to happen. Now, since GDPR starts in force on the 25th of this year, there's going to be a lot of time where organizations in the UK are going to still have to comply with GDPR. It's unknown at this point, once the UK leaves the EU, how the actual regulation will be upheld, or if the UK will come up with their own.
Add to that, so under the Brexit rules, the UK government has to take each of the European laws that are enacted and put them forward to Parliament for ratification. So GDPR will be one of those that needs to become a local law within the UK, and that will have to go through ratification in Parliament. So it could be ratified in Parliament and continue to be in effect.
Okay. And we're just going to keep going here. We're over a minute, but there's still a lot of people still hanging on the webinar, so we'll keep going for a little bit. This question came in from Dave. What happens when someone invokes the right to be forgotten, but local laws prescribe that records/data must be retained for record-keeping audit purposes?
Matt, I think that's one of those ones that's going to play out in the courts. I think, there are areas, and if you look at most legislation, they talk about the way the different laws will interact. GDPR can't look at every scenario, and it can't be prepared for every contingency. So right now, you look at the potential for organisations having to make a decision about how they're going to handle that. It could be that they've got requirements to forget the individual, but still retain things like financial records. It may be that they have the requirement to maintain that for their own local legislation, in which case it would overrule GDPR. So I think that's more of a legal question that lawyers will need to hash out for the individual organisations based on their regulations.
Got it. Another question came in about opting out. This question around if there's a breach and you go through the notification process, are you going to be looking hard at the ease of opting out and whether that was available to the EU data residents?
Absolutely. So from a breach standpoint, and in fact, what GDPR provides to the citizens is the ability for them to start to make lawsuits as a result of not being compliant with GDPR. So that ease of opting out, in fact, is one of the conditions of GDPR. It's got to be easy to do. Once you opt out, you've got to immediately stop. So there's none of this, we'll remove data in a week's time that we often see, or the ability to opt out being very ambiguous as to how you achieve that. It's got to be unambiguous. They've got to be able to opt out at any point, and you can't necessarily ding them for opting out. That's one of the other things that's included in GDPR is protection against the individuals from being adversely affected by opting out.
My question came in here on the DPO role. That does not need to be a net new hire, correct? That just needs to be a description that is assigned to someone or a title assigned to someone. Is that correct?
Yep, yeah, that's right. And it doesn't have to be a dedicated role. It can be someone that's you know, serving other roles within the organization. The one piece there, though, is they do have to report, you know, directly up into, you know, kind of the C-level suite. So they have to have direct line of communication into the executive level, that DPO role, whether it's internal or if it's an outsourced role.
It's very similar, Matt, to HIPAA in that you can have a data privacy officer or a privacy officer in HIPAA's scenario that is also the security officer, is also the CISO. It's, as Nathan mentioned, it's more important about who they report to than necessarily the business role that they perform. There are requirements within GDPR as to what the DPO must do in that role.
Got it. Well, why don't we kind of wrap it up? Looks like we've had several folks drop. But I think, Sean, maybe just to summarize, you know, I think obviously they took 4 years and agree upon the law and then announced in 2016, so they've kind of given organizations 2 years to get compliant. Sounds like still a lot of unknown based on there is some very general statements within the law today that I think are a little bit open for interpretation. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the law is applied, where some of these fines shake out, and where kind of things go in the next 6 months. Any other comments?
I think this will play out in the courts. I mean, the whole point with Privacy Shield, the point of safe harbor, all of those played out in the courts and impacted their ability to be applied. So I think for most organizations, and that's why we suggest a measured approach here, is until you start to see the fines come down and organizations actually paying those fines, we're probably 2 or 3 years away before we know exactly what the true impact of GDPR is going to be on companies from a security standpoint, from a privacy standpoint, but also from a financial monetary impact.
Well, thank you, John, Keith, Nathan, for attending. Thanks to all those that attended. If you do have any follow-ups, please pass along the email. We're happy to get on the phone and spend more time talking about it. Have a good afternoon. Thanks, everyone.